Yo, how's it going everybody? You got Sketch here and welcome back to the channel. On this episode we're going to be talking about an unofficial sequel to one of my favorite games that was one of the biggest disappointments that I can remember even way back when. Much like D-Force, which I joke about constantly, there does exist a game that exceeds its legacy. A sequel that even Capcom often refuses to acknowledge, but for good reasons which we'll discuss. And stacked against its original Genesis debut, it pales in comparison. We're looking at Strider Returns Journey from Darkness, developed by Tiertex and published by US Gold, releasing to microcomputers in 1990. This would be reworked and ported to the Sega Genesis and Master System in 1992. Depending on region, this was known under two different titles, either as Strider 2 or Strider Returns Journey from Darkness, though its infamy can be called whatever you want. Let's look at the story here real quick before diving into how this was even able to happen. The plot is very simple. Save the Princess of Planet Magenta from the alien terrorist group holding her captive, led by Grandmaster Mayo. Strider here, Hinjo, swings their cipher to save the day, and the battle's gonna be fierce, and the enemy is gonna put you through 5 stages of pure pain. Are you ready? You might notice how this isn't Strider Hero, but another Strider, and you may also notice how Capcom is seldom mentioned beyond a small line of text in the intro screen saying that they've licensed this to US Gold. This game exists due to a series of loopholes that Capcom was entirely hands-off with, and lacking knowledge of what US Gold was cooking up behind the scenes. When Strider released to the arcades, home ports eventually followed, with British publisher US Gold securing the rights to home computer ports. Developer Tiertex would be commissioned with porting the game to several microcomputer platforms like the Amiga, Amstrad CPC, Atari ST, Commodore 64, and ZX Spectrum, all within a 6-month window. While some aspects will be dialed back, these ports were still fairly well received. Once the Genesis and Mega Drive versions came out reprogrammed by Sega in 1990, audience would almost see an arcade-perfect port becoming one of the system's first hit cartridges. Capcom were satisfied just letting the Strider name ride, considering it was popular. The one thing they didn't account for was US Gold retaining an active license. Since they have the code and the assets already on deck, they saw an opportunity and began creating one of the biggest blemishes the series would possibly ever see. While Tiertex were known for porting games quickly, Original Productions was not, and while they could use the assets, they could not use the canon character Strider Hero. The adventure with Hinjo would originally have him shooting a gun and turning into a robot during boss encounters. While it's an amusing concept, it's a hard left from the source material. They essentially gathered the lore from the box art and did service level research on the series itself. This would later be reworked for the Genesis and Mega Drive, removing the robot segments and gunplay while borrowing some assets from the Sega Genesis code. I know this is a long diatribe, not even talking about the gameplay yet, but we're about to get into that. Gameplay wise, you've got a 2D action platformer where you hack and slash your enemies through 5 stages, reaching the final encounter with Grandmaster Mayo. Something you might notice right away is the difference in your attack being a cipher that sweeps instead of the original half moon slash. This animation does 2 things. It decreases your attack range, and it drops your frames as you slash since the animation bogs down your frame rate. Luckily, you have the option to change the animation back to the arcade Genesis original, otherwise this would be unplayable off the rip. You can still cling to walls and ceilings, and you've got shuriken projectiles that you can stack and throw forward. Your cipher is the safer of the 2 weapons you've got, but these are here if you want to use them. You can still slide like the original, and something I didn't know here is that your slide actually gives you a few invincibility frames. You've also got 2 health bars, one for yourself and one for your options during boss encounters. While this all sounds good on paper, now throw in some incredibly sluggish frame rates, which tank often. To say this game chugs is generous, and this is on a cartridge that has more storage than its arcade original port. The set pieces that were common thread of the original, like running downhill, avoiding an exploding avalanche, or scaling helicopters up to the battleship Balrog, are all replaced by labyrinth-style levels that are easy to get lost exploring, often with nothing to find. Levels are also laid with numerous beginner's traps that can smoke you even within the first few moments of gameplay, but once you can spot and anticipate them, you can begin to move forward. Stages mostly tend to go up in the beginning and have you navigate mazes filled with enemies and traps. These range from dashing foot soldiers to stationary turrets, and later on, even aliens. Mid-bosses range from mechanical insects to recreations of the previous encounters like the gravity chamber from Strider 1, but just not as good as before. These are some prime examples of horrendous stage design, especially once you get to the second stage. Most folks typically have long since turned this shit off by now, but while the opening stage seems different yet promising, what comes next is one of the major walls you'll hit. Stage 2 is a maze that has long jumps and electric barriers that will knock you back. If you're really unlucky, this can put you in a death loop that bounces you between barriers, smoking you almost instantly. It's mainly a timing that you need to mind and watching the path each barrier takes to know your window to move, but as mentioned earlier, Tiertex really went to town, leaving traps on top of traps. Once you get through the electric gauntlet, you encounter Grandmaster Mayo. You might wonder, why is the final boss appearing this early? But we'll get there soon enough. just know you'll see this encounter again. It's also worth noting that Strider Returns has some very strange bugs. That Stage 2 encounter with Grandmaster Mayo has two things that I've seen happen, both of which cost you time. First being how certain parameters will cause this encounter to crash the game, freezing mid-encounter, which can also happen at the final encounter. The second is that when you finish the fight, granted it doesn't crash, the laser barriers don't turn off, and if you're low on health and move towards the exit, it's likely you will die here. Once you respawn, the lasers will be off, and you can easily walk to the exit. Stage 3 is the Hive level, and yes, it's actually called that, and this is where you begin to see a pattern in the level design being mid at best. Random leaps of faith and no real indication as to where you're supposed to go will be an ongoing theme moving forward, but when in doubt, go up. Stage 4 is more the same in the alien depths, where instead of going up, you're going down, and the boss is a mechanical T-Rex with a flamethrower. I wonder if the Tiertex team were reading Dinosaurs for Hire comics when they were developing this game. Once you get to the final stage, you've got yet another labyrinth mixed with a boss rush, and at the end is the same encounter from Stage 2. The difference is here is that instead of going down to the exit, you have a brief escape sequence that leads to the final boss fight with the princess herself. Plot twist, right? The weak point is the bottom of her containment unit, and once you get that last hit, she pumps her fist in triumph as you both escape. Graphics wise, this is hardware haberdashery at its finest, and another point where you'll see reused assets from Strider 1 amongst other things. Strider Returns strangely has no credit sequence once you finish the game, though it is rumored that this was developed by a very small team. US Gold allegedly wanted the game out quickly for the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis, and that came with cutting some corners in order to make this happen. As a result of the rush development, this allowed the era of the game being programmed at half speed, running at 25 and 30 Hz, which makes so much more sense why this game plays how it does compared to the Strider 1 port for the Genesis. Strider Returns game engine was mostly built from the ground up, while taking elements from the Genesis port source code and straight up ripping assets out of the game code that they could get away with. This is very apparent when you watch the interlude cutscenes, which were all ripped and expanded photos from Strider 1's cutscenes, featuring characters that aren't even in this game. Bosses like Solo return along with Grandmaster Mayo, but the rest are mostly original creations. Stages have layered scrolling at times, but designs lack the dynamic scenery of the original game. Elements are dialed back quite a bit with a lot of negative space, and while none of it looks outright terrible, it just doesn't compare to the arcade port that released 2 years prior. The set piece action sequences and pacing seen in the arcade port are all gone here, and with everything running slower on top of that, you aren't left with much that stands out. Enemy designs are mostly a mishmash of robotic insects, foot soldiers, aliens, and mechanical foes, with a couple returning from Strider 1 like the Sawbots. Sprites beyond Strider and the boss characters just look slapped in like a sticker on a notebook. If you look at the enemy design from Strider 1, it quickly becomes obvious which one put in more effort. Sound-wise, Strider Returns gets a little bit of a break since this is the best part of the game by far. While the audio for impacts and such aren't spectacular, they've got some weight to them in the sound department. The music is passable here, with the Forbidden Forest tune being a low-key belter, but sadly, even the music gets mid before too long. While the music is okay, the sound effects are often somewhat flat and tinny, unfortunately. There's a fair amount of speech modulation here, which is likely where most of the cartridge storage went, with some surprisingly good voice in it during the cutscenes. This is one thing that Sega Strider port lacked compared to the arcade version, so that was an interesting spot for Tiertex to actually one-up Sega. While it's a small win, that's about the only dub Strider Returns is coming away with here. Overall, Strider Returns was and still is one of those games that is the outlier of the whole Strider franchise. It's still amazing that Capcom initially wanted to be so hands-off with the ports that Tiertex and US Golds had the license to release this catastrophe on a cartridge. Osmond, the official Strider 2, and the Strider reboot from 2014 are all great games, but Strider Returns is truly clap cheeks. Between the lackluster graphics, slow, uninspired gameplay, cheap enemy placement, even cheaper beginner traps, horrendous level design, and bugs that can flat out crash the game during the Grandmaster battles, this is a wonder how it ever got released, let alone reworked and ported to the Genesis and Mega Drive. Strider Returns Journey from Darkness gets a 3.5 out of 10. This is straight up painful to play, and honestly makes D-Force look good. Then again, no it doesn't. It's one of those games that even 28 years after playing it the first time is just as bad as I remembered, if not worse. If you can muscle through this one, despite the credit limit and the timer, you'll see how unpolished and rushed the programming was, and the ending is not going to make it any more rewarding, besides to marvel in how much of a departure this is from the source material. Capcom would still farm out development to other studios in the future, before keeping it mostly in-house like they do currently, but after something like this getting on shelves back in the day would likely make any company value their IPs more after seeing just how hard a popular franchise can flop, especially in the wrong hands. Both this and the Sega Program Strider port are about the same price for loose and complete copies. Loose cards are going for around $15 and around $30 for complete copies. Do yourself a favor, if you see the original Strider for Genesis, go for it since it's a great game and highly replayable, but Strider Returns is certified cheeks. Honestly, not worth your time. And if you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. If you find these videos helpful, that's awesome. I'm glad to use it as a resource. Check back often, we'll have more reviews and commentaries coming up in the near future. But until then, take it easy and stay safe out there. I'll see you on the next one.